One of the fascinating and I think interesting things about color is the way that different colors interact with one another and in groups. And in this video, we're going to look over a PowerPoint that is taken from the article on color, which is in your reading section. So you will want to read that and also review these slides for your Assessment 1 quiz. Color interactivity is a fascinating study in the way that you can achieve things like special effects, optical illusions, you can achieve wonderful unity, and you can also create disharmony in a composition if you're not really clear on how to use color. But first, let's talk about some perception topics and how we see color. It's interesting to note that when we look at an object, we see it perhaps as being a certain color, but in actual fact, the object is not considered to be of a certain color. It is what we see it as. When we look at something, light enters our eyes, which have receptors in them, which then connect to the optical nerve and go to our brain, and that gives us our sensations of color. So when we look at, and I know they always use an apple as a example here, but so we're seeing in this image that red is not really inherent in the apple, but it is the color that is reflected onto our eyes and into our eyes and processors, and all of the other colors are absorbed. So we do see this as red. And one thing you might consider too is that the same apple would look differently if it were in a different light situation. So it's really all about the light waves and the way that the light enters our eyes and is processed. So continuing with the fruit metaphor, a lemon is not really yellow, a mango is not necessarily red and green, it just appears that way because those are the light wavelengths that have been reflected back to us. So again, changing light conditions will also change the way something appears. And this is also interesting to note in, if you've ever been in a room that's been painted a certain color, and you'll notice that in certain lights, certain weather conditions, certainly the time of day, the color can appear very, very different. So it's all about the way that the light enters the eyes. And a little bit of anatomy here. We have things called rods and cones in our eyes. They are receptors and sensory kind of sensory units that measure the type of light and the amount of light. We have rods and cones. Now rods are around the edge of the retina and they are more about black and white information, whereas the cones are concentrated more in the middle, and you can see the retina here, and they have to do with color information. So they process all of this, send it down the optic nerve to our brains. So light and dark contrasts, such as you see with these black squares, stimulate our rods, and the color stimulates our cones. If you should ever need to remember the difference between rods and cones, a little tip is that the word color has a C in it, and so does the word cones. So rods and cones. One of the most dramatic interactive effects in color are the complementary colors. And as you know from a previous video, those are the colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel. Red and green, yellow, purple, and in this case blue and orange. And they will have the most dynamic and dramatic impact when they're used together. In this case, we have an identical orange square, one on a white square and one on the complementary blue square. And the one on the blue looks just a little bit brighter even though it's the same color because of that intense kind of push-pull effect of the complementary colors. This is really great if you want a dramatic effect, and you can also get a vibration effect if you use similar amounts of contrasting colors. Sometimes that's desirable, sometimes it isn't. But it is good to know that complementary colors are very dramatic in their interactivity and their relationship. Now here's a more subtle use of how complementary color can work. This is a piece that has an analogous color scheme, and I talked about analogous schemes in the previous video. You'll see that this poster here is using green, blue, and purple, analogous colors, for the background, and then it has the large black shape of the fish. But what makes it really stand out, or what creates the focal point there, which is the fish's eye, is the use of bright orange. Now, bright orange is the complement of blue, so it's going to stand out. Even though it's on black here, it still stands out, and it creates what we call a pop of color. And also those magenta circles, which are in a similar analogous relationship to the purple and green and blue, still they're contrasting enough that they act as a secondary focal point. So you can always create a nice bit of interest with little pops of complementary color. One thing to remember about warm and cool colors is that warm colors will always tend to advance and be closer to the viewer than cool colors. Now, admittedly, this green is rather hot and bright, but the red and orange circle is brighter still, and even though it's set in front of the square, still the colors do leap out at you. And so it's good to remember, if you want to set something back in a composition, setting it in cooler colors will be a good way to do that, and then the warm colors will advance forward. Now, here's another tip for creating the illusion of distance. You see this poster, and it is it gives the impression to me of standing on a stage and looking into a theater full of people. And so the word bravo is repeated and the letters are overlapping, but what also creates a really nice sense of distance is the use of saturation changes. When you look off in the distance, everything that's farther away is going to have less saturation because it's farther away and there's atmosphere and there's more between you and the element. So a great way to give that illusion in a 2D graphic design piece is to lower the saturation of something as it goes off into space. And you can see it's pretty dramatic here. Value and contrast. Now, here's an example of different colored text on different colored backgrounds, and some work, some don't. Some are practically impossible to read, and some are really quite good. You should be able to tell which ones you prefer. This is a quote by a well-known graphic designer named Paul Rand, and it is true. If you don't have contrast, if people can't find visual interest in something, or if they can't read it, in this case with text, you're dead. The graphic designer is dead in the water because no one's going to look at their piece. It won't be a success. So keep in mind that whenever you're using something that you want to contrast, you want to make sure that there is sufficient contrast so that what you want people to look at will stand out. And this absolutely goes without saying, of course, for text. It really should be one of the most important things to keep in mind for text use is good contrast. This also applies for screen use. Now, this course is more based in print production and printed terminology and ideas, but this particular concept also applies for screen use, absolutely. Lots of contrast, especially for text. Here's a quick example of the 3 color schemes you're going to be exploring for one of your assignments. I worked up this design and I used the analogous colors, the complementary, and tertiary colors. And you can see the difference that something immediately takes on when you're using different color schemes. Even though the design is identical, it has quite different flavors due to the colors that I used. We're going to finish off this video with looking at a couple of different color schemes that you can explore. This one is a triadic color scheme using 3 equally spaced colors on the color wheel, and you'll notice that they point to tertiary colors: blue, green, red, violet, and yellow, orange. And these have been used to nice effect in this interior design setup here. The walls are kind of a warm yellow orange, and they contrast beautifully with the blue-green pillows and sofa and tabletop. And then the reds that are used tend to be a little bit on the red-violet side for the pictures on the wall, and there's a couple of warmer reds in here, but overall the feeling is that of three colors in the room, and they work very well together, and they create a nice sense of cheerfulness and harmony. You want to be careful when you're using color schemes, 3 or more colors, to keep the saturations and the brightness values fairly consistent so you don't overwhelm with one or more. Now this is a new color scheme. I haven't talked about this one yet. It's called Tetradic, which means 4 different colors. And you can see in the diagrams there are 4 different ways to choose colors from the color wheel to create interesting color schemes. And this painting does a very nice job of using 4 different colors in quite a nice way. It's a lot of color, there's a lot of change going on. You want to be careful when you do that, when you get into multiple colors, that you're not using really varied tones or saturations, because you need something to unify them. And I would say that the saturation level of these colors here is quite good. They all seem to work. One doesn't overpower the other. So this is a really nice example of a tetradic color scheme. Lastly, one of my favorites, the split complementary color scheme. I talked about this briefly in the earlier video, but here's an example of a very contemporary interior design room that uses the split complementary. This might not be for everybody, but again, for a contemporary look, you'll notice the designer has used green, and then instead of plain fire engine red to offset it, they've used orangey red, as you see in the pillows, and then a blue red, more of a purple red, for the chairs. And it's the dynamic combination of those two played off of the green that I think really pulls this together nicely. So here are examples of different split complementary schemes you can use. So I hope that this overview of perception and color interactivity will inspire you as you learn more about color and start to use it in a dynamic manner in your designs. Thanks.